The science of psychology has been far more successful on the negative than on the positive side. It has revealed to us much about man's shortcomings, his illnesses, his sins, but little about his potentialities, his virtues, his achievable aspirations, or his psychological health. Being a parent is the hardest thing in the world, the psychological toll it takes on you because these lives are in your hands. I take it very seriously. The relationships that people have, that are sexual, psychological, emotional, these relationships are not open to supervision by parents, schools, churches, or government. Nobody has any right to intervene at all in any kind of relationship like that. I don't know if it is a spiritual, physiological or psychological phenomenon, but I believe now more than ever that singing is a universal, built-in mechanism designed to cultivate empathy and compassion. Technology will mirror the culture and the psychology creating it. We need new psychological scaffolding to work with, less fear and more optimism. It's in the best interest of the radical left types, best psychological and strategic interest, to refuse to admit to the possibility that reasonable people can object to their ideological staff. Because if reasonable people objected, that would imply that their ideological stance is not reasonable. Humans have continued to evolve quite a lot over the past 10,000 years, and certainly over 100,000. Sure, our biology affects our behavior, but it's unlikely that humans' early evolution is deeply relevant to contemporary psychological questions about dating or the willpower to complete a dissertation. I also used these realistic sounds in a psychological way. With the good, the bad and the ugly, I used animal sounds, as you say, the coyote sound. So the sound of the animal became the main theme of the movie. If we depend for our happiness on another, on society or on environment, they become essential to us, we cling to them, and any alteration of these we violently oppose because we depend upon them for our psychological security and comfort. To be able to function in late capitalism without being a psychological wreck, it is necessary to accept the insane as standard. Self-pity, a dominant characteristic of sociopaths, is also the characteristic that differentiates heroic storytelling from psychological rumination. When you talk about your experiences to shed light, you may feel wrenching pain, grief, anger, or shame. Your audience may pity you, but not because you want them to. Often, we ignore the fact that our spiritual condition and psychological state of mind are highly affected by what is happening to us physically. Sometimes depression is simply the result of exhaustion. I totally deplore the notion of an MD giving pills to patients, a medical doctor giving psychological or psychoactive change agents to another person. I was never close to Jerry Falwell because he had his ministry, I had mine, and we came from different theological training and from a different psychological education. Most of what I've written songs about are things that come out of the confusing emotional, spiritual and psychological period of time when you're going through puberty. One can't live mindfully without being enmeshed in psychological processes that are around us. The quantity and quality of consciousness, one may say, have always been growing throughout geological times. In this respect man, in whom nervous organization and therefore psychological powers have attained an undisputed maximum, may be considered, scientifically, as a natural center of evolution of the primates. At real, psychological pressure on the players is much more serious than at United. This is good. At many clubs, you don't know the consequence of playing badly. I was one of those children forced into fighting at the age of 13, in my country Sierra Leone, a war that claimed the lives of my mother, father and 2 brothers. I know too well the emotional, psychological and physical burden that comes with being exposed to violence as a child or at any age for that matter. If the real radical finds that having long hair sets up psychological barriers to communication and organization, he cuts his hair. If I were organizing in an Orthodox Jewish community, I would not walk in there eating a ham sandwich unless I wanted to be rejected so I could have an excuse to cop out. The principle that human nature, in its psychological aspects, is nothing more than a product of history and given social relations removes all barriers to coercion and manipulation by the powerful. Acceptance of one's life has nothing to do with resignation. It does not mean running away from the struggle. On the contrary, it means accepting it as it comes, with all the handicaps of heredity, of suffering, of psychological complexes and injustices. It's a really deep and layered psychological situation, making music with someone. if they're trying to make something real and personal. It's almost like dating, you allow yourself to be consumed by the other, not in a bad way, but in a way that happens in nature. It is imperfection, not perfection, that is the end result of the program written into that formidably complex engine that is the human brain, and of the influences exerted upon us by the environment and whoever takes care of us during the long years of our physical, psychological and intellectual development. To live fixated on the future is to engage in psychological denial. It is a form of psychic violence that prepares us to accept the violence needed to ensure the maintenance of imperialist, future-oriented society. A child who plays a game of football for one season without any documented concussion, several months after that season, if you subject his brain to sophisticated psychological testing and radiological testing, functional MRIs, there is evidence of brain damage. Why do we feel jealousy? Therapists often regard the demon as a scar of childhood trauma or a symptom of a psychological problem, and it's true that people who feel inadequate, insecure, or overly dependent tend to be more jealous than others. Bullying leaves permanent psychological scarring and young people become adept at learning what hurts, verbally and psychologically. Looks, personality and status are all easy targets, and particularly difficult to change. Terrorism is a psychological warfare. Terrorists try to manipulate us and change our behavior by creating fear, uncertainty, and division in society. I continuously go further and further learning about my own limitations, my body limitation, psychological limitations. It's a way of life for me. You don't train someone for all of those years of medical school and residency, particularly people who want to help others optimize their physical and psychological health, and then have them run a claims processing operation for insurance companies. Hitler never abandoned the cloak of legality. He recognized the enormous psychological value of having the law on his side. Instead, he turned the law inside out and made illegality legal. I think The Walking Dead is very interestingly paced. It's slow, almost like an old western. It's also very stylized, visually. I think it's very pretty. It's more of a psychological drama than anything else. I think hell exists on Earth. It's a psychological state, or it can be a physical state. People who have severe mental illness are in hell. People who have lost a loved one are in hell. I think there are all kinds of different hells. It's not a place you go to after you die. Patients who trust their doctors and have a psychological expectation of getting better could trigger a reaction in their body. When I look at my life, I see that I wanted to be free of the physical plane, the psychological plane, and when I got free of those I didn't want to go anywhere near them. At a deep psychological level, convincing young people that they will get the respect, admiration, love that they are looking for through consumerism is a manipulation of a deep human instinct to want to belong. The new meaning of soul is creativity and mysticism. These will become the foundation of the new psychological type, and with him or her will come the new civilization. Defined in psychological terms, a fanatic is a man who consciously overcompensates a secret doubt. The great thing about baseball is the causality is easy to determine and it always falls on the shoulders of one person. So there is absolute responsibility. That's why baseball is psychologically the cruelest sport and why it really requires psychological resources to play baseball, because you have to learn to live with failure. Darts is more psychological than anything, staying mentally strong. Adolescence is society's permission slip for combining physical maturity with psychological irresponsibility. Festivals promote diversity, they bring neighbors into dialogue, they increase creativity, they offer opportunities for civic pride, they improve our general psychological well-being. In short, they make cities better places to live. You must keep raising this game to higher and higher levels, as on the pool table, mastering eventually the psychological angles. Your playing is a pleasure, all the way to the end, to death, when the game is over. There are various psychological advantages you can take into boxing match. One is getting your opponent to fight with emotion and anger because he hates you. It may sound surprising when I say, on the basis of my own clinical practice as well as that of my psychological and psychiatric colleagues, that the chief problem of people in the middle decade of the 20th century is emptiness. Social psychology has, as a rule, dealt with various phases of social experience from the psychological standpoint of individual experience. I always give much attention to military character and to psychological and morale conditions. People reveal so much of their mental processes online, simply because the psychological effect of anonymity just means that a whole raft of inhibitions are left alone when people log on. Do we talk about the dignity of work? Do we give our students any reason for believing it is worthwhile to sacrifice for their work because such sacrifices improve the psychological and mental health of the person who makes them? Visit our website for more quotes, quoting.com.